My name is Peter Norman. I'm a a art handling technician at the National Portrait Gallery in England, and I'm also a photographer specializing, hopefully, in photographic historical processes. And a few years ago, I decided to embark on something that I dreamt up called the Autochrome project. And the Autochrome project is a personal endeavor to try and produce a workable method of recreating the Lumiere Autochrome. And I'll just talk about that for a little bit. The Autochrome was one of the principal ways of producing color photography at the turn of the 20th century, and it was developed in France. And the process was patented in 1904, and it consists of a glass plate coated with a microscopic layer of dyed potato starch, which has been dyed red, orange, green, and blue, purple. And this is dusted onto a glass plate, which then creates a random color mosaic in which each particle of starch acts as a microfilter. So when light hits the plate, it's been split into its constituent parts of red, green, and blue. And on top of it is coated a black and white emulsion. I've got some examples of it here. This would have been a box that was for sale about 100 years ago, and this is like one of the stereo formats. It was 4.5 centimeters by 10.7. I'm not quite sure what that translates to in imperial measurements, which I'd imagine it's what most of you are familiar with. So I'll just get some of these out. Okay, so this is quite a small format. So this, for those of you who know early glass photographic processes, most likely would have been put into something called a Jules Richard Veriscope camera. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, so on this side, this is the way it would have gone into the camera, and you have a micro starch layer on front, and on the back of it is the photo emulsion, which is coated onto it. So that it goes in with the mosaic facing the lens, so that when light passes through, it's split into its constituent parts and then goes through that layer and then hits the photo emulsion below it. The plate's then put through a reversal process, which involves developing the exposed negative image and then bleaching it out using an acid. This then leaves a positive mask behind, which is then redeveloped as a positive slide. So I'm going to try and give some example of what one of those look like using my. It's a rather DIY approach to it. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. Now this one isn't a stereo that I've got here, but hopefully it should give you. Can people see that? See that quite well? Okay, so this is be like a positive image. So what I'd imagine most of you are used to seeing with like 35mm slides. A much-cited characteristic of the Autochrome is its color palette, and it sort of brings a lot of comparisons with early impressionistic painting and pointillism. And if you look at the idea of dyed starch as an analog to colored pigment, it sort of dovetails quite well between photography and painting, which I know that that was always a theme that was talked about, whether they could really sort of coexist as methods. So this is what has really appealed to me in order to inspire a project to try and recreate the process, is wanting to be able to explore that color palette and working with the material such as glass, to make new photography. So I think following the revival of early photographic processes and interests, this has definitely spurred quite a bit of interest in autochromes, even though it's kind of like perhaps a lesser known area of historical photography. But due to the complexity of the autochrome production technique, this involves trying to break down the process into its constituent parts. So trying to look at how the starch layer could be recreated, how that could be coated onto glass, and then how one goes about looking at making photographic emulsions that go on top. And one of my go-to sort of pieces of information for this is the Lumiere Autochrome book. It's Preservation, Technology, and History by Bertrand Levedrine and Jean-Paul Gandolfo. And they've looked into the conservation of photographs on autochrome, and trying to recreate the process as well, which makes this a really quite interesting read. And so that's inspired me to learn about dyeing starches and different types of starches to help develop this project. But I found it particularly rewarding for such a project is to sort of understand how we got to the autochrome, what made the technology possible. And that really kind of involved going back to the start of photography and learning what the fundamentals of photochemistry were, which is to take a light sensitive compound and place it in suspension somehow, either in a colloid or an emulsion or in some other form of liquid, and then use coat that onto a support such as metal, with the daguerreotype or tintype, or glass with albumen or collodion, to works on paper, like with the calotype and that. So I began to do sort of a few like little workshops and learning the sort of basics of the process. My first one I did was a wet collodion workshop, where we learned how to take it's a blackened plate and coating it in collodion and sensitizing it to silver. And from that, I then started to look into the dry plate photography that followed the wet plate photography. So this is the time when photography and convenience, I think, really starts to become synonymous with one another. And dry plate is obviously what it sounds like. Plates were coated with a silver gelatin emulsion, and these could be dried and then taken off on a trip, for example, and then processed at a later date. So what I subsequently have been doing is I went to the George Eastman House in Rochester in New York back in last October to learn silver gelatin emulsion making with Nick Brandreth and Mark Osterman, and they showed me how to make emulsions over a 4-day period, coat them onto glass, and we made several plates, self-portraits out in the gardens that they have there. And then also learnt about optical sensitizing, because the one thing that early processes all have in common is that they're only sensitive to blue and UV light. So that's from the daguerreotype, the calotype, the wet collodion process to early dry plate photography. In order to be able to arrive at color photography, or where color photography is possible, is to sensitize the emulsions that you're making with optical sensitizers. They call them sensitizing dyes. And the history of photography follows quite a linear process in that during the sort of early 1870s, they started to discover ways of sensitizing the plates so they could record the blue and the green areas of the spectrum, and then red came later on. And before then, color photography, there was sort of a couple of processes that tried to explore what the possibilities were. One of those that some people might know is called a Joly plate, which was etched with a colored dye on the front of the plate and with the emulsion laid on top. But because it was only sensitive to blue and green light, it would a full color record wasn't quite possible, and it wasn't until the Autochrome came along that we can really see proper color photography. So in support of that, I've been making blue sensitive emulsions myself before moving on to optical sensitizing. I have some examples of the glass plate negatives that I've been making. Also, I think I have quite a poor attempt at trying to make a sequential stereo image. The other day, so let's see. Okay. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay, or would they prefer if I was on the light box? No. Any better? Not so good. I'll try a different one.
Too bright.
Too bright.
Yeah, maybe move it back a little bit.
And center it on where your camera's aiming, so it focuses on it. It'll auto adjust for the light that way.
Yep, right there.
So basically, I work in a plate size called quarter plate, which is 3 1/4 by 4 1/4 inches. And I'll just show you the camera that I use. This is my speed graphic camera that I use, which works really well for glass plate photography or film photography, depending on what you want to shoot. I load up my dark slide. The glass plate goes in here, goes into the back of the camera, and when I'm ready to take my image, I just pull the dark slide out and hey presto. So that's kind of where I'm at on the project at the moment. Still very early days, but hopefully that'll be of some interest to you. And yeah, I think that's kind of it.
Thank you, Peter. I have been looking through some of these questions. So first of all, people saying that that's an excellent book, by the way, that you shared there. And somebody provided a link to where they can purchase that. I am not immediate. I thought I saw a question early on, but I'll ask. I have a question of my own.
Sure.
What is like it just in exploring this? What has been your biggest challenge?
The hardest challenge is probably the fact of just working on my own on a project like this, and not trying to sort of figure out the mistakes along the way has been quite hard. So that's what was really rewarding about going to Eastman House, because I could be shown, like, you know, the best way of coating glass by hand, because you are literally just pouring it out of a little beaker and floating it onto glass and then cooling it and chilling it, knowing how to, the process is very similar to cooking, and it's kind of when to add, you know, the silver and at what rate and everything that can, it's things like that can sort of slow you down if you haven't got a tutor or someone who is familiar with the process. But at the same time, those are the strongest learning aspects, I think, are the mistakes along the way. And I think it's important, whilst we're doing these things on Instagram, is to sort of show where everything doesn't quite go right. I think quite used to sort of giving a very polished look to our projects on public platforms. So I think it's important to see when, or show when things aren't going quite so well. And on this sort of project, it's quite ambitious. That's been, you know, the biggest reward, but also challenge at the same time, I think.
Okay. I have one more question, but someone else posted one, so I'll ask that one first. How do you get an even distribution of colors?
Well, it is a random distribution, just by the fact that you are mixing microscopic particles of dust with each other. And this was quite noticeable perhaps on the smaller formats of the Autochrome, is that you can see like color clumping together. It's not the most perfect process in the world. You might see sort of spots of red and green, which are only, you know, quite small to the eye, but say if you look at it under a microscope, that will be a very large group area of green or red or whatsoever. But the starch mixture itself, in order to get the most even distribution, was mixed for quite a few months in like industrial mixing units to be able to make sure you're not going to get like a massive amount of green or a massive amount of red. I think the larger the format size that you go up, the eye sort of adjusts accordingly, and the resolving power of the process seems slightly smoother. That's my general opinion. But so like the larger stereo formats tend to look really good, whereas the smaller stereos, they do see, you know, there's a very noticeable grain, if you like, and that's not from the photo emulsion, that's from the actual color screen itself.
So I have a question. Where, like, I guess your end point to the project, like, what is your goal? Like that you will say, success.
Well, it would be to recreate the process. There's quite a bit more to it that I haven't been able to cover in this talk, and it's very much about the complexities of the actual manufacturing process. I think when the project is brought to a satisfying conclusion is when I can recreate the process. That being said, if it never worked, the wealth of information that one learns along the way is reward in itself, even if it only ever is just black and white photography on glass, and that's as far as I can go, then that's fine. And I think a large amount of the research that I've gone into has been concentrated on stereoscopy, and because the sheer prevalence of the autochromes that I've found have been stereos. Pascal has himself a rather wonderful large collection, I believe 750 autochrome stereo plates, and he's been kind enough to share some of those with me, and they're absolutely stunning to see them. I think as a diversion to the project, if one was so inclined, one could. Sorry, my dog's running around trying to get my attention. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry if there's a bit of a squeaking noise. I think if one was so inclined, there could easily be a article or a publication about autochrome stereo photography. There are some books on autochrome that have been released over the past 20 years, but it's still quite a nuanced area of photography. What I love about the recent stereoscopy volumes that have come out is the strong ideas and themes that they're curated with. One of them is, I'm sure you're probably quite familiar with, the Brian May Diablerie book. I became very interested in stereoscopy when I was at university doing my photography degree, and covered part of it in my dissertation into early forms of virtual reality. And I was quite amazed at the breadth of the content that stereoscopy covered. To me, it didn't seem such as just a parlor game or an entertainment tool. I found that there was a strong element of social documentary that was used for that. Probably, I don't know if it's actually been written about in those kinds of ways. I've got this other book, Civil War in Depth, and I found this incredibly powerful, the brutality and the cost of war being documented in this process, which was commonly known as for entertainment and leisure. And I found the way that the two that came together as being incredibly exciting. So the long and short of it is, if it were possible to recreate just stereoscopy and dry plate method, I believe that the areas that could be used in like social documentary brought into, say, the 21st century would be really interesting and really exciting, beyond probably what I've seen in that field, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I just have one last question.
Sure.
From the audience. Is moisture a problem in the preparation, keeping the grains very dry?
Yes, moisture is a problem. It has to be dried out. Sorry, I'm just trying to get away. This is real life, I guess.
Yeah, it's not very loud.
Yeah, so do you mean in terms of mixing the starch mixture together? Or
there's not, yes.
yes, the starch mixture is first rinsed in alcohol to almost desiccate the material. I'm not entirely sure what it does on a molecular level to the starch, and then it's dyed, and it's in very strong concentrated dye, and then rinsed in alcohol again, and then it's dried. Then it's dried and then mixed together. It's I've been asked before whether it was like just mixed all in water and then poured on, but it is actually fully dry. The plate is covered with a like rubber-based glue, and then it's dusted on. So yeah, it has to be as dry, and then it gets varnished again.
And is low humidity needed to minimize clumping?
I would assume so. That sounds like that would be the most obvious way of preparing it. So temperature control would be an aspect if, say, one person's sort of doing it just in their garage or a shed, for example. You want to sort of, it would be best to do it in a temperature controlled environment.
Great. Thank you so much. Oh,
I've got a couple more questions.
Yeah, sure.
Would you delve into why the red layer took so much longer to develop than the other two layers?
Why it took longer. I think they were trying to hit on the right kind of dye that would absorb that area of the spectrum. Now I read that there's. Sorry, can I just? I'm just going to put my dog into another room. Sorry.
We are pet friendly here at the BSC. I haven't seen any cats today. Usually there's a cat showing up every meeting that we have. Everybody's cat is napping. Only dogs making a show today. It's okay.
Sorry. If he was small enough, I'd bring him up. Bring him up here, but he's a little bit too big for that. Okay, back to the question about, was it red sensitivity?
Yeah, the difficulties. It was like what, 10 years in between the other layers.
Yeah,
layer.
I believe so. I'm not entirely sure why it took as long to get to that. I know that they had issues with developing that. I know that they said when they discovered green sensitivity, the erythrosine was the dye that they were to use for that, and erythrosine is a very common dye now, used in all sorts of products, and in confectionery and medications and things like that. The red sensitizing dye, penocyanol, that came much later, and it came from a group of cyanine dyes, which I believe it just took a longer time to discover them and synthesize them into dyes. So the material cyanine would be an industrial process, and it takes many stages to start with the raw material to right to the point where you can actually obtain a dye for something. And I would assume that it was probably by happenstance that this material that was newly developed just happened to be able to develop in the red area of the spectrum. The dye industry of the time, especially in the mid to late 19th century, pretty much exploded with developments of the earlier dyes in Germany. So it's funny. It does seem to sort of follow a linear process. It's not like they managed to find red dye first and then green dye afterwards. And as you follow it through the spectrum, like the blue is next to green, and that which is next to red. So yeah, I think it was just the development of other industries along the time. But I'll look into it a bit more.
Cool. And my other question was, as someone who's working on restoring a lot of glass stereo views where there's damage to either the right panel or the left panel, typically by approximating the depth map and cloning bits from one side to the other, it occurs to me that with the rather coarse granular structure of the Autochrome, that might not work well. Have you had any experience attempting to restore an Autochrome stereo view, and was it visually distracting to have the exact same grain pattern on each side of the image?
I haven't actually done any restoration or via digital media with Autochrome processes. I think that can be like a whole other area as well to get into, in terms of like the ethics behind, do we leave this as a defective piece of material and show it how it actually is, or do we sort of conserve and hide it away, its imperfections? I quite like the imperfections within glass plate photography. I know it sounds probably counterintuitive, but I think that was one of the things that brought me to historical processes to begin with. They're not perfect by any means, if that's what you want to gain. And I mean that if I wanted like high definition, high quality, I would go to use digital. But yeah, I like the I suppose it's like the imperfections are the qualities for me. That being said, I think it, not that it shouldn't be done or anything like that.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for presenting, and let this be a lesson to any of you that are new. This is his first meeting and he's presenting, so.
It's my first presentation I've actually ever done on what I'm doing, so thank you very much for
yes, thank you.